Hey friends, tonight we're beginning with something colossal. Something that still casts a long shadow across the desert floor. The Great Pyramid of Giza. For many, it's a symbol of mystery and majesty. But tonight we're not here to marvel, not really. We're here to settle quietly into the lives of the people who actually built it. The ones who didn't have their names carved in stone. The ones who carved the stone. Because for them, this wonder of the world wasn't mystical, it was work. Back-breaking, sun-drenched, dust-choked labor. A daily rhythm of lifting, hauling, chiseling, and enduring. Done not for glory, but because there wasn't much of a choice. So before we step back in time, take a moment. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan, just for that soft, soothing hum in the background. Let yourself breathe slower. If you'd like, leave a quiet hello in the comments. Maybe let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always comforting to see how many people gather here across time zones just to rest and drift off together. Now, let's close our eyes and imagine not the golden glow of pharaohs, but the dusty, cracked hands of those who carried their dreams. Let's begin. Before the first stone was ever shaped, before the desert was scarred with ramps and ropes and sweating bodies, there was home. And for many of the workers who would one day labor on the Great Pyramid, home meant something far quieter. Fields of barley, narrow canals lined with reeds, the gentle slosh of water jars balanced on shoulders at sunrise. Life, before the quarry, had a rhythm. Not easy, not luxurious, but familiar, predictable. Days were built around the flooding of the Nile, the growth of the crops, and the rustle of family life behind mud brick walls. Many of these laborers were not slaves in chains, as old myths once claimed. No, they were often conscripted farmers, peasants in small villages, whose names you won't find on papyrus scrolls. When the Nile receded and the soil dried, the fields would wait. And during those long months between harvests, the state called on its people. The pharaoh, seen not just as a king, but as a living god, required a tomb worthy of eternity. The call came down through officials, scribes, overseers, like wind through palm fronds, and eventually reached the doorsteps of families who had little room to say no. There was no dramatic ceremony, no scroll presented with fanfare. Often it was a quiet acknowledgement, perhaps a visit from a local administrator, a handful of bread, the promise of payment in beer, or the reassurance that this was an honor. Your son, they might say, will be part of something sacred, a monument to the gods, a resting place for the divine soul of Egypt. That is, if he returns. Young men lean from farming, and middle-aged fathers with sun-leathered skin would gather simple belongings. A linen wrap, a wooden walking stick, maybe a family amulet tucked quietly beneath their tunic, kissed by a mother's hand before the journey. They didn't pack for a war. They packed for work, and so they walked, sometimes for days, toward the construction sites that buzzed with the slow motion of national ambition. The air grew drier, the landscape barer. Villages thinned into scattered huts, then gave way to camps. These were not cities in any grand sense. They were built quickly, from stone and mud brick to house the thousands called to work. Each structure was functional, the walls low, the roofs flat, the spaces tight. You could smell the smoke of bread baking, mixed with the sour tang of sweat-soaked linen drying in the sun. The men would arrive not to applause or welcome banners, but to orders. There were overseers with shaved heads, carrying reed whips, though the whip was used more as a threat than a tool. Hierarchies were everywhere. There were crews, and within crews, small teams. Some workers hauled stones, some carved them. Others prepared mortar or carried water or food. You didn't get to choose, you were placed quietly, like a gear in a much larger machine. And this machine was relentless. For many first-timers, the adjustment was brutal. You might have been a farmer used to waking with the birds and working until the sun turned orange, but here the sun wasn't just a backdrop, it was a hammer pressing down on your spine. The tools were unfamiliar, and your body hadn't yet learnt the strange rhythm of stonework. You'd go to bed aching, your arms trembling, your palms raw. The first nights were the worst. You'd lie beside strangers, your body coated in dust, ears still ringing from shouted commands. Some whispered prayers, others just stared at the ceiling, blinking against the dark. But eventually, routine crept in. A strange sort of peace in predictability. Wake up, eat bread and onions, walk to the ramp, lift, haul, repeat. The mind, after enough repetition, stops resisting. You start to mark time by meals, by small blessings, a cup of cool water, a joke whispered in your native dialect, a rare day when the breeze carries a hint of Nile moisture. These were the things that kept you going. Back home, life continued without you. Your family waited. Maybe they sent messages through others returning from the site. Maybe not. Letters were rare, and memory had to suffice. In the camp, the idea of home softened, blurred. You carried it like a ghost in your chest, invisible only when you closed your eyes. Some tried to leave, some succeeded. Others were punished, not cruelly, not theatrically, just quietly. A changing duties, harder labor, a dismissal from your group, a reminder that you were replaceable. And yet, despite it all, there was a strange kind of pride, not in the grandeur of the pyramid, most couldn't even see its full scale from where they worked, but in the endurance. You were part of something that required more than stone. It required patience, obedience, a willingness to vanish into the task, to let your name be forgotten in exchange for the privilege of shaping eternity. No one wrote songs for the workers. No priest recited their names. But somewhere, beneath 1,000 tons of limestone and granite, their sweat remains, dried into the mortar, pressed between each block, a monument not just to gods and kings, but to the quiet strength of those who showed up, lifted what was too heavy, and did it again the next day. And so, that was life before the quarry, a fading rhythm replaced by a harsher one, fields exchanged for ramps, family warmth swapped for communal exhaustion. It didn't start with chains, it started with footsteps, and a name that would never be remembered. The day began not with an alarm, but with a quiet stirring. Dozens of bodies shifting on woven mats, the scent of dust and old sweat heavy in the early morning stillness. Before the sun even broke the horizon, the camp was already humming with low voices, the muted shuffling of feet and the crackle of bread warming over small fires. The workers' village at Giza was alive long before the pyramid site stirred, like breath held just before the first chisel strikes stone. A laborer rose with the others, not out of eagerness, but because not rising meant falling behind. His limbs were stiff, his palms calloused and lined with small cuts from the day before. The linen he wore was simple, rough-spun, stained, but sufficient. There was no time for long rituals or quiet contemplation. The first task was food, and it was as humble as it was vital. Bread, baked in round clay ovens, sometimes still warm if you were lucky. A handful of dates, and beer, not the golden froth of taverns, but a thick, porridge-like drink made from fermented grain. It was sustenance, not celebration. Then came the walk. From the village, the rising pyramid loomed in the distance, its shape slowly taking form against the lightening sky. The air was still cool in those early hours, and that brief comfort clung to the skin like a blessing. Men walked in quiet groups, not because they were forbidden to speak, but because there wasn't much left to say. What could be said that hadn't been uttered the day before, or the week before that? Reaching the plateau, the order of the day was already underway. Overseers were there first, standing tall on stone platforms, arms folded. Their shaved heads gleamed in the morning light, and their voices carried over the plain like distant echoes. Instructions were shouted in short bursts. Group leaders, men with years of endurance behind them, translated the day's goals into action. Stone needed moving, ramps needed repairing, more mortar had to be mixed. A fresh shipment of limestone blocks from Tura had arrived by boat, and teams were already assembling to haul them up the causeway. Each crew had its role. One team transported water from the Nile, carried in clay jars balanced on wooden frames. Another prepared the mortar, a mixture of gypsum and sand, sometimes with powdered limestone, kneaded in large vats with bare feet. But the bulk of the day belonged to those who moved the stones, not with machines, not with magic, but with ropes, levers, sledges, and unrelenting repetition. The process was slow and deeply physical. First, the stone was loaded onto a wooden sledge, greased with animal fat or wet sand to ease the dragging. Dozens of men took up the ropes. They didn't chant, they didn't shout. They leaned, strained, pulled in time with each other, guided by a foreman who clapped or tapped in rhythm. Each step forward was hard-earned, and the sound of wooden sled runners scraping against packed earth became the heartbeat of the worksite. Breaks were rare, not because there was cruelty, but because time moved differently here. The pyramid wasn't built by the day, it was built by the moment, each one indistinguishable from the last. When the sun climbed higher, the heat began to bite. Workers wrapped linen cloths around their heads, shielding their eyes from the brightness. The air grew dry and heavy, and the dust kicked up by their labor settled into every fold of clothing, into their hair, their mouths. Midday brought a pause, but not quite rest. Bread again, beer again. Sometimes lentils or onions if the supply was good. Men sat beneath makeshift awnings or the rare shadow cast by a stone block. They stretched out their legs, rubbed their shoulders, leaned against each other without speaking. And then, like a tide, they rose again. Afternoons were the hardest. The sun pressed down with full weight. Muscles already sore began to ache more sharply. The tools, chisels, mallets, adzes, grew heavier in the hand, even though their weight never changed. Masons chipped at blocks to smooth their sides, guided by red ochre lines drawn by skilled artisans. The sound was constant, stone on stone, copper edge against limestone, the steady rhythm of human effort carving permanence from impermanence. For some, the day meant climbing. Up the sloping ramps that wound around the structure like a coiled serpent, pulling sledges up to the next layer where workers waited to position them. Stones were not placed casually, they were nudged, tapped, shifted by bare hands and wooden levers until they sat flush with the one before. Then mortar was packed into the seams and the next block was summoned. There was no cheering when a layer was completed, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement, a glance among workers, and the start of the next row. As the sun began to fall, shadows lengthened, and the plateau cooled. The energy on the site did not collapse, but thinned. Voices softened, movements slowed, tools were gathered, stones left in place. A final pass was made by the overseers, noting progress, inspecting alignment, and then the walk began again, back toward the village. Feet dragged a little more this time, backs hunched deeper, but there was also a strange stillness in that return, a kind of peace earned through sheer exhaustion. The body's ache was total, but so too was its silence. At camp, fires were lit again. Food was handed out. The beer flowed more freely, thick and comforting. Some laughed softly, others sat alone, their gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Stories from home were shared, half remembered and embroidered with each telling. Wounds were cleaned with water and scraps of linen. And slowly, one by one, men curled on their mats, heads resting on arms or bundled cloth, and sleep took them not like a thief, but like a wave. They would rise again tomorrow, and again after that. The pyramid would grow. Their names would not. But they had lived this day fully, in stone and sun, in silence and sweat, in the endless rhythm of the Giza Plateau. To understand how the Great Pyramid was built, you don't just need to study the stones. You need to look at the bread ovens and the beer jars, at the thick crusts of loaves cracked open at dawn, at the swollen feet of a man who's just walked 5 miles in sand, and the quiet gratitude in his eyes as a warm meal lands in his hands. Because what truly sustained the builders wasn't divine purpose or national pride. It was calories, it was community, it was coping. The average worker consumed an enormous amount of food, not as a luxury, but as necessity. Moving blocks of limestone weighing several tons required strength, yes, but more than that, it demanded endurance, day after day, week after week. For that, the body needed fuel, and so the bread. It was everywhere. Baked in communal ovens made of clay, fired with dry brush and palm fronds. These ovens filled the workers' villages with the smell of char and yeast. The bread itself was coarse, dense, and shaped in loaves that were more function than flavor. Made from emmer wheat or barley, the flour was roughly ground using stone querns, often leaving behind tiny bits of grit, unseen but brutal over time on a person's teeth. This was not the kind of bread you dipped in honey or shared during festivals. It was hearty, dark, and a little sour. A survival loaf. Each man was allocated a portion daily. Sometimes women, wives, sisters, daughters worked nearby in the support villages to help prepare the food. Other times, specialized bakers were part of the rotation. These weren't chefs, they were workers too, managing heat, kneading dough, pulling loaves with burned fingers, keeping pace with the never-ending hunger of thousands. Then came the beer. But forget what you know about golden glasses and frothy heads. Ancient Egyptian beer, the kind served to pyramid builders, was thick, unfiltered, and eaten more than drunk. It resembled a gruel, frothy, earthy, slightly tangy. Made from half-baked loaves soaked in water and fermented with yeast, it was poured into ceramic jars and ladled out with wooden spoons. It wasn't for celebration, it was for hydration, for sustenance, and perhaps most of all, for morale. The beer provided calories and, more importantly, made the dust easier to swallow. Onions, too, were common, sharp, pungent, and easy to store. They were believed to restore strength and prevent disease. Some days lentils or garlic appeared. Rarely there was fish from the Nile, salted and dried to last longer in the heat. Meat was not unheard of, but uncommon. Reserved for skilled workers or gifted on feast days tied to the state religion, most laborers filled their stomachs with grain and legumes, not luxury. Still, this simple fare formed the backbone of an empire's greatest project. It wasn't about taste. It was about balance, about getting through another 12-hour day beneath the sun without collapsing, about walking home with enough energy left to wash a wound or whisper a story. But food alone didn't sustain the worker, not completely. There were blisters, on hands, on heels, behind knees where linen rubbed skin raw. Calluses grew thick and black. Cracks formed at the corners of fingers, turning red with dust. There were no gloves, no ointments beyond oil, water, and the occasional herbal paste made from desert plants. Fragrant, but weak. Water was precious. Laborers drank from large clay jars kept at intervals around the site. These were refilled constantly by water carriers whose job was quiet and essential. Without them, everything stopped. The water wasn't always clean. Some workers suffered from stomach illnesses that spread quietly through the camps, sapping energy, shortening lifespans. There were no hospitals. Wounds were bound in linen, fevers were left to break. Or not. Still, the human body adapts. One worker's suffering became another's advice. Wrap the rope around your chest, not just your arms. Breathe through your nose when the dust rises. Put the beer jar in the shade before noon. Tips passed down not by scribes, but through sweat and whispered in tired voices. And then there was rest, perhaps the rarest commodity of all. Nights in the worker villages were short. Sleep came quickly, not because the beds were soft. They weren't, but because the body demanded surrender. Most slept on mats woven from reeds or rushes. A few had blankets, but many used just a folded cloth, or nothing at all. The desert air turned cold at night, and men huddled close. Sleep was light, interrupted by coughing, the occasional cry from a blister breaking open, or murmured dreams from someone who hadn't spoken all day. But even rest could be shared. Some men found comfort in small routines, carving simple shapes into scrap wood, shaping stones into tiny amulets, singing low songs from the Delta or Upper Egypt before sleep. These weren't grand gestures. They were survival habits, quiet rituals of dignity in a life that offered little space for individuality. Once a month, or during major festivals, some workers returned home. Their families often waited by the fields, squinting into the light, unsure who would return or in what condition. Others stayed on year-round, sometimes because they needed the rations, sometimes because they simply no longer remembered how to go back. These workers didn't leave records, no journals, no letters. What remains are their tools, their bones, and the villages they left behind. And yet, in the excavated kitchens and broken beer jars, we see it. A system of nourishment, of resilience, of quiet, persistent care in the midst of impossible labor. They weren't fueled by divine inspiration. They were sustained by bread, beer, and the blunt refusal to stop. And somehow, that was enough. As the sun dipped low behind the rising pyramid, the Giza plateau softened. Its glare gave way to shadows, long and quiet, stretching across the desert floor. The air, once sharp with heat, turned cool and brittle. The workers, hundreds of them, left the site slowly, feet dragging, arms limp, tools swinging loosely from tired hands. The sound of labor gave way to the gentle hush of dust settling and sandals scuffing dry ground. Their home was not far. The workers' village lay in the shadow of the very monument they built, close enough to wake early, far enough to forget it for a few short hours. It wasn't a slum, nor was it luxurious. It was functional, built from sun-dried mud bricks stacked and plastered together with Nile silt. The homes were small, square, and simple. Most had just one room, perhaps two if a man shared space with relatives. The roofs were flat, often layered with reeds and more mud. Sometimes they doubled as sleeping spaces on warm nights when the interior walls trapped too much heat. Inside, the homes were dim and cool. Windows were rare and tiny, no glass, just open slits for air and the occasional shaft of dusty light. The floors were hard-packed earth. Furniture was minimal, if present at all. A stone for sitting, a mat for sleeping, maybe a jar tucked into a corner. The walls bore the marks of wear, fingerprints in the clay, soot from cooking fires, graffiti scratched with a stick by someone too tired to talk. These weren't places to decorate. They were places to lie down and forget. And lying down was what most did first. Boots or sandals kicked off, tunics loosened, the day finally allowed to fall away. Some stretched flat on their backs, letting their limbs go heavy. Others curled up, knees drawn in, instinctively protecting sore stomachs or overworked joints. The body knew what it needed: stillness. There was always a hum to it, soft but constant. Fires being lit, water sloshing in clay jars, quiet laughter, the sharp sound of a pot clinking against a stone hearth, someone coughing in the next room, a baby crying nearby. There were families here too. Not all workers were single men. Some had brought wives and children who lived nearby in auxiliary quarters and supported the larger effort with cooking, mending, carrying water, or grinding grain. The line between laborer and family blurred in the evenings, when everyone returned to the same dusk and the same dim lamplight. Meals were often shared, though not lavish. A loaf passed from hand to hand, a bowl of lentils thickened with barley, beer poured from a tall jar into smaller clay cups, warm and sour. There were no dining tables, no plates, just laps, fingers, and the familiarity of repetition. Some sat outside their doors, backs against sun-warmed walls, watching the last light disappear beyond the plateau. Others stayed indoors, speaking softly about home, about their own villages, their past harvests, their children. The talk was rarely about the pyramid. No one said, "Today I helped place a block on the king's burial chamber." Instead, they said things like, "My hands are shaking again," or "They gave us smaller loaves today," or "The new man from the delta snored like a donkey." It wasn't bitterness, it was normalcy. You couldn't dwell on what you were building. It was too large, too abstract, too distant from the sore muscle and cracked skin. So you focused on your feet, on your bow, on your breath. In some homes, small oil lamps flickered against the walls, casting faint orange glows and long shadows. The lamps burned animal fat or castor oil, with wicks made from twisted linen. Their flames were weak but steady, often the only light until morning. Under these lights, a man might inspect a blister, unwrap a binding, or hold a pebble smoothed by his fingers all day. Little gestures, tiny acts of presence. If one listened closely in those hours, you could hear quiet songs, often hummed, rarely sung aloud. Ancient melodies passed down not through lyrics but through rhythm. Sometimes a reed flute might play, its notes, simple, lilting, meant more to soothe than to entertain. Children, dirty and sleepy, sat in laps or sprawled on mats, eyelids drooping. Some men told stories, half-remembered myths about gods and monsters, often shaped more by their fatigue than the truth. And always, the dust. It never left. It clung to hair, to brows, to the folds of cloth. Even in rest, the workers scratched at their skin, rubbed their eyes, blew it from their noses. The desert was inside them now, part of their breath, part of their sweat. There was no washing it away. Not with the limited water they had, not with the few cloths used to wipe down at night. Sleep didn't always come easily. The body begged for it, but pain lingered. Shoulders ached, knees throbbed. The heat of the day often lingered inside the mud walls, making the nights stifling. Men shifted, adjusted, found new positions, muttered curses or prayers. Some tied thin strips of linen around their joints to ease the strain. Others simply lay still, eyes open, listening. Eventually, though, sleep arrived. Not like a gentle guest, but like a tide. Slow, inevitable, and full. In the distance, the pyramid loomed under the moonlight, still and indifferent, while beneath it the lives of the nameless flickered and dimmed like oil lamps, one by one, and by dawn they would rise again. Not all the workers who walked onto the Giza plateau walked off again. Some never made the return journey to their village, never saw the Nile shimmer under the afternoon sun, never held their children again. The desert claimed them. Not all at once, not violently for most, but slowly, steadily, like sand filling a jar, grain by grain. And for those who died while building eternity, their own eternity looked very different from the one they carved for the king. There were no golden sarcophagi for them, no perfumed chambers or priestly processions. Yet, surprisingly, there were burials, quiet ones, simple, respectful, and shockingly close to the pyramid they helped build. Just west of the Great Pyramid, archaeologists have uncovered rows of modest tombs, narrow shafts and rectangular chambers carved into the limestone. These weren't the tombs of nobles, but of labourers, people with names long lost, whose backs were bent by limestone and whose hands bore the bruises of repetition. Some of the tombs were made of mud brick. Others had stone markers with faint inscriptions, sometimes no more than a name and a short blessing. There were no treasures, just bones wrapped in linen, curled as if still seeking rest. These men, and occasionally women, were laid down by their peers, fellow workers who paused just long enough to dig, to rap, to say a few words before returning to the site. Death came in many forms: heat stroke, infection, falls from the ramps, collapses under the weight of stone, not always dramatic, often unseen. A man would sit down to drink and not rise again. Another might grow slower with each passing day, until one morning he simply didn't report for work. There were no formal ceremonies for these deaths. The overseers may have recorded the loss, redistributed the labor, and moved on. But among the workers, grief was quieter, passed in glances, in silence around the fire, in the folding of a tunic left behind. If the deceased had family in the village, they might mourn for a night, tell a story, say a prayer. But life continued. It had to. Still, not all deaths were anonymous. Some workers, skilled artisans, foremen, or those who had earned the respect of their peers, were given more lasting tributes. Their tombs were marked with small stelae, carved with basic hieroglyphs. Some included a brief mention of the deceased's role: stonecutter, water carrier, foreman of 10. These modest honors suggest something important: that the labor wasn't entirely invisible, that among the dust and forgotten names, some memories were preserved. It's hard to say whether the workers believed they would be remembered. Most probably didn't think in those terms. Their world revolved around duty, endurance, and faith. Not faith in legacy, but in continuity. That the pyramid would stand, the king would reach the afterlife, and Egypt would remain strong. Their role in that chain, though small, was sacred in its own way. The workers may not have expected divine reward, but they believed in Mahat, the principle of balance, order, and cosmic justice. To live according to Mahat was to play your part without complaint, to respect the cycle, to keep the world turning. Even if no statue bore your likeness, even if your tomb was shallow and nameless, you had upheld the order, and perhaps, in some way, that was enough. Of course, not everyone was so philosophical. Some must have felt bitter, must have questioned the fairness of building an afterlife they wouldn't share. The king's tomb would gleam for centuries while their own bones lay in unmarked graves. But they didn't have the luxury of rebellion. Their resistance took other forms. Small ones. A loaf pocketed for a sick friend. A pause to watch the sunset, even when shouted at. A name etched secretly into the underside of a stone. Some of these quiet acts have survived. Graffiti found inside the pyramid walls. Names of crews. The friends of Khufu. The drunkards of Menkure. Not formal records, but echoes. Laughter scratched into eternity. Proof that even in the most rigid system, humanity lingers. And then there are the bones. Archaeologists have uncovered remains with worn vertebrae, fractured limbs, and healed injuries. Signs of lives lived under intense strain, but also signs of care. Bones that show healing, meaning the injured were fed, tended to, kept alive by others. These weren't disposable workers. They were part of a machine, yes, but one with warmth, with community. There's something deeply moving in that, in knowing that even within the most immense state project in human history, there were moments of kindness. of someone sitting beside an injured friend, offering water, whispering a story, or wrapping a wound. That too is part of the pyramid's foundation. Today, tourists walk the perimeter of the Great Pyramid. They stand in awe, take photos, marvel at the mystery, but few look to the west, to the humble graves barely visible in the sand. Fewer still think about the nights those workers spent on stiff mats, the blisters that cracked open in the heat, or the quiet farewells offered by torchlight. But the pyramid remembers, not in words, but in weight. Every stone bears the touch of hands now gone. Every corner was set by tired eyes and bent backs. The whole structure is a monument not just to a king, but to the thousands who carried him there, one block at a time. And somewhere, deep beneath that desert silence, the workers rest. Not forgotten, just quiet, as they always were. When most people picture the Great Pyramid, they see only the surface, that endless slope of limestone rising with eerie precision into the sky. A mountain of stone, silent and eternal. But the true story of the pyramid isn't on the outside. It's beneath the stones, beneath the grandeur, beneath the illusion. What lay beneath was not treasure or sacred mystery. It was labor, structure, mistakes, fixes, corridors and cavities hidden from the sun, carved not by artisans with visions of heaven, but by workers with aching backs and practical minds. The pyramid was never just a tomb. It was also a labyrinth of ramps, shafts, blocks, voids, and load-bearing compromises. It was as much engineering as it was theology, and beneath its skin, the truth is buried. Not only about how it was built, but about who paid the price. The core of the pyramid wasn't smooth. It wasn't even particularly beautiful. The inner structure was made of rough-hewn local limestone, piled and aligned with extraordinary care, but with no concern for appearance. These inner stones were heavy, pitted, and imperfect, chosen for function, not aesthetics. The sleek, bright casing stones, the ones that once shone in the sun, were only a skin. The heart was messy. Beneath this uneven heart ran a web of passages. The ones we know, like the descending corridor, the ascending corridor, and the grand gallery, are just the beginning. These weren't made by magic. They were carved with copper chisels, sweat, and time. Each inch of tunnel had to be measured, planned, chipped out of bedrock by hand. Torches lit the way, throwing shadows across the dust. The work was slow, dangerous, and often invisible. You don't see those tunnels from outside, but they're there. Imagine being one of the men working on those inner spaces. You aren't under the sun anymore. You're deep in the pyramid's belly. The air is cooler, but heavier. Dust lingers, floats, settles in your nostrils. The light is faint, just enough to see where to strike. You're crouched, swinging a hammer against a chisel, the sound echoing off the walls. Every blow seems to take something from your arms. The walls tremble with vibration. Your fingertips go numb. Sometimes, a chunk of stone splits and falls, narrowly missing your foot. There is no applause. No, almost there. Just stone and more stone. Some parts were planned, others weren't. The pyramid shows signs of adaptation. Corridors that end abruptly, passages rerouted, an original burial chamber abandoned partway through. These weren't acts of divine perfection. They were signs of improvisation, of project managers adjusting the blueprint when things didn't work, of builders who had to pivot midstream, carving new paths, rerouting labor, wasting weeks or months of work. Imagine the frustration. Imagine the silence when the overseer said, "This chamber won't do. We start again." Then there are the voids, strange, empty spaces buried deep within the stone. Some are thought to be structural, designed to relieve pressure. Others remain unexplained. They're not chambers, not rooms, just gaps. Spaces left behind by the puzzle of engineering. Perhaps they were mistakes. Perhaps they were moments of mercy, places where a block cracked wrong or the ground shifted. So the builders moved around it, left it be, covered it with more stone, let it disappear. Above, the world imagined perfection. Below, the workers knew better. Is the matter of the grand gallery, a long, steep hallway leading to the king's chamber. It's impressive, vast, echoing, but again, it wasn't built to impress. It was a solution to a problem, a structural bridge, a way to distribute the weight of millions of tons above without crushing what lay below. The ceiling of that gallery is a marvel. Layers of corbelled stone leading inward to avoid collapse. The kind of design that takes more than strength. It takes patience, precision, and days, weeks, months of slow, incremental work. And above that chamber, hidden even further, is another truth. 5 stress-relieving chambers stacked on top of each other, each filled with graffiti. Not curses or pleas, but names. Crew names. Notes from the workers, the friends of Khufu, the drunkards of Menkore. These aren't lofty inscriptions, they're casual, almost playful, the way someone might sign a wall after finishing a shift. These bits of human handwriting, left in the dark where no one was ever supposed to see them, are now the only signatures that remain, not from kings, but from common men. Below the pyramid, there were also logistical tunnels. Channels for water, perhaps storage rooms, or ramps buried beneath finished layers. Many of these were later filled in or collapsed. Some led nowhere. Others connected workspaces that only existed for a few months before being sealed forever. To the builders, these spaces were temporary, but for those of us peering back through time, they tell the deeper story. And then there's the bedrock. The entire pyramid rests on it, but not evenly. Part of the rock had to be leveled by hand, not with dynamite or bulldozers, but with picks and baskets. Imagine scraping away solid stone day after day just to get a flat surface. No one sees that labor now. It lies invisible beneath the first row of blocks, beneath the dust, beneath the legend. To be beneath the pyramid, quite literally, was to live in a forgotten world. Dark, cramped, necessary, every space carved, every gap left, every mistake patched was part of a structure the world would call perfect, but only because they couldn't see what lay beneath. And for those workers, those men holding flickering torches in stale air, the pyramid was not a monument, it was a maze. A burden. A job that buried them in both purpose and stone. Before the first stone was placed, before a single chisel touched limestone, the pyramid had to be imagined in the dust. Not just dreamed, but measured. And not with lasers or satellites or even precise steel rulers. It was measured with rope. And eye. And patience. To build something that would remain standing for thousands of years, you had to begin with the ground. And the ground, flat as it might seem under the desert sun, is rarely level. So the workers began by mapping it, walking its length, setting up markers, studying shadows. Surveyors used simple tools, plumb bobs, A-frames, straight rods, knotted cords. These were not instruments of magic, but of deep familiarity. These men had watched the Nile flood and retreat every year. They knew how to trace lines in soft earth, how to find the midpoint between stars, how to stretch string taut and keep it that way, even in the wind. The ropes they used were not crude. They were made from flax or palm fibers, spun tightly and cured in oil. Some were marked at regular intervals with knots or beads. These ropes were their tape measures. When pulled taut between two posts, they gave direction. When wrapped around stakes, they gave shape. But more than that, they gave consistency. Ropes didn't lie. Eyes did, sometimes. But rope could be trusted. And then there were the shadows. To orient the pyramid, the workers had to align it precisely with the cardinal points: north, south, east, west. They did this not with compasses, but by watching the sun, measuring how shadows shifted across the day, observing how the stars turned overhead at night. In particular, they watched the star we now call Polaris. Though it wasn't perfectly aligned at the time, it was close enough to be useful. They noted its position, then drew lines, then measured again, repeatedly. This wasn't a fast process. It required stillness, observation, a kind of patient silence. One could imagine a group of men standing quietly at twilight, staring up, wrapped in thin linen, arms folded against the desert chill, waiting for the stars to drift into place. Someone drew a line in the sand, another nodded, and then the process began again the next night, just to be sure. Once orientation was established, the real measurement work began. The base of the pyramid had to be square, not almost square, but truly square, each side equal, each angle a perfect 90 degrees. Over a span of hundreds of cubits, even a small error could ruin everything, so the workers created reference points using wooden pegs and measured diagonals, adjusting until both crossed the same center. The cubit itself was their unit of measure, roughly the length from elbow to fingertip, but standardized. Egypt had official cubit rods, often made of wood or stone, marked with divisions. These rods were handled by trained workers, the measurers, whose entire job was to ensure consistency. Some rods were ceremonial, others practical, but all of them were used again and again, held up against ropes, laid flat across blocks, compared in silence. The measuring wasn't a one-time thing, it was continuous. As each layer of stone was added, as each block was hauled up a new ramp, measurements had to be checked. Was the alignment still correct? Was the slope holding steady? Was the core drifting? Workers with measuring ropes followed the builders like shadows, correcting, guiding, quietly reminding the hands to stay within the lines drawn by unseen minds. This was labor, but it was also devotion. Not to the pharaoh perhaps, but to the task itself. A pyramid was not just a pile of stones. It was a design, laid out in invisible lines. The angle of the slope, about 51 degrees, was fixed. The blocks had to rise in that perfect taper, year after year, row after row. Every mistake had weight, every miscalculation had consequences, and yet, mistakes did happen. We know this because in certain areas, the internal corridors shift slightly off course. Some casing stones were shaved down at odd angles to correct for earlier bulges. Adjustments were made, subtle, quiet, practical. There was no drama, just recognition. And revision. Imagine being the worker who noticed it. A line of stones drifting off true, maybe by a finger's width, maybe more. He'd run his palm along the edge, frown, then call over a foreman. Together, they'd test it with rope and rod, and then they'd act. No shouting, just action. Shave this side, shift that line, remeasure, begin again. All of this was done without plans drawn on papyrus, without blueprints. The pyramid was kept in the minds and eyes of the surveyors and architects. Men trained not only in math, but in watching, in trusting the tools their ancestors had used for centuries. They weren't engineers as we understand them, but their mastery was no less complete. Their lines were straighter, their measurements more durable, their errors fewer than ours might have been. There is something deeply human in all this, in the idea of men walking dusty paths, stretching ropes, squinting into the sun, then nodding in agreement. In the quiet precision of repetition, in the sacredness of getting it right, not for applause, but because the structure depended on it. And beneath every layer of the Great Pyramid, beneath every block and beam, those measurements still exist, etched not into the stone, but into the placement of each one, an invisible grid laid down by rope and eye, steady hands and patient minds. They didn't just build the pyramid, they measured it into being. Stone is patient, copper is not. And yet it was copper, salt red and far from perfect, that met the limestone and granite of the Great Pyramid day after day. It seems almost foolish when you think about it, shaping a mountain with metal you could bend by hand. But this is what the workers had. Copper chisels, copper adzes, copper saws. And a whole lot of time. The stone cutters were not magicians. They were men with calloused hands, who understood the stubbornness of rock and the limits of their tools. Copper dulled quickly. Against limestone it held up reasonably well, but against granite, especially the granite used for the king's chamber and interior elements, it wore down fast. After a few hours of chiseling, a tool might be too blunt to be useful, so it was taken away, reheated, hammered, reshaped, over and over. The blacksmiths, tucked into hot little workshops near the quarry or on the edge of the construction site, worked constantly, not making new tools, but resurrecting old ones again and again. Each tool told a story. The edge of a chisel might show tiny ripples from the last sharpening. A saw could have uneven teeth from quick repairs. These weren't precision instruments. They were companions to human labor. Each one was held, swung, leaned on, cursed at. The tools aged just like the men who used them. But if the tools were imperfect, the workers adapted. They learned to use repetition instead of force. A chisel wasn't meant to break a stone with one strike. It was meant to persuade it, tap by tap, cut by cut. The masons understood that stone responded not to speed but to rhythm. You hit, you shifted, you hit again. The work was slow, deliberate, almost meditative. The process of cutting a block began with marking, lines drawn with red ochre, rubbed from the fingers of a scribe or senior worker. Sometimes those lines were still visible when the block was placed, a faint red whisper beneath the dust, never meant to be seen again. Once marked, the stone was scored with chisels, grooves along the lines creating a guide, then deeper cuts, sometimes with assistance from dolerite hammerstones, hard, black stones that could withstand more abuse than copper ever could. The dust was constant, fine, white, and clinging. It coated the skin, filled the mouth, worked its way under fingernails and into wounds. Men coughed. Some wrapped linen around their faces, not for fashion but for survival. Eyes watered, lips cracked. But the stone didn't care. It sat still, waiting to be shaped. The strain on the body was relentless. Fingers were the first to suffer. Gripping a chisel for hours meant pressure on the knuckles, tension in the wrists. Blisters formed and burst. Skin peeled, joints swelled. Some workers wore wraps or cloth guards, but these only helped so much. Eventually your hands hardened, or they gave out. Many did. Archaeological remains tell us that pyramid workers, especially masons, suffered from arthritic damage in the hands and wrists. Some bones show signs of repetitive stress injuries, fused joints, and even healed fractures. One misstrike could break a finger, one slip could leave a deep gash. There were no hospitals, no breaks for recovery. If you could still grip the tool, you worked. If you couldn't, you were reassigned, to water hauling perhaps, or mortar mixing, until you could again. And yet, the work continued, stone after stone, wall after wall. For the final work, like shaping the casing stones or aligning internal joints, chisels were used alongside rubbing stones. Large blocks of sandstone dragged back and forth across the surface until it smoothed. Imagine that, dozens of men sanding a wall, hour after hour, with nothing but grit and muscle. No machines, just motion. For the largest cuts, saws were sometimes used. Copper blades guided back and forth through stone dust mixed with sand and water. The abrasive slurry helped eat away at the surface, slowly, painfully. The sawing sound must have been constant in some corners of the site, a soft scraping rhythm beneath the shouting of foremen and the grunt of haulers. Tools broke, often. When they did, they were taken to the forge. Blacksmiths worked with bellows and fire pits, reheating, reshaping, plunging metal into cool water with a hiss. The air there smelled different, like heat, sweat, and something faintly metallic. These smiths were essential. Without them, nothing moved. They were quiet heroes, tucked away in the smoke, breathing life back into broken copper. And when the day ended, the tools were counted, cleaned and stored. Chisels laid in rows, saws hung on hooks, hammerstones stacked neatly. There was a ritual to it, a respect. You didn't toss your tools aside, you placed them because you'd need them tomorrow and the day after that, for years. Despite the roughness of the materials, despite the bruises and the blisters, the outcome was astonishing. Blocks cut so precisely they needed no mortar, joints so tight you couldn't slip a knife between them, all done with copper, with arms, with determination. We often marvel at the final product, the smooth angles, the massive scale, but the real wonder lies in the wear, in the chipped tools, the bent nails, the burned fingers and swollen palms, the parts no one writes about. The pyramid was not shaped by magic. It was carved by broken fingers holding dull tools, striking stone beneath a sun that never blinked. There were no alarm bells, no red flags, no safety nets. If something went wrong on the Giza Plateau, it went wrong quietly, quickly, or slowly, but always without ceremony. There was no protocol for injury, no relief team waiting in the wings. When accidents happened, they unfolded in the dust, and the work mostly kept going. It's easy to think of the pyramid site as orderly, controlled, even sacred, but in truth, it was messy, complicated, dangerous. A living construction zone stretched across months and years. Stones weighing tons dangled on wooden sledges, ramps rose steep and unguarded. Men walked in tight formations, shoulders brushing, ropes swinging, tools flashing in the sunlight. It was coordinated, but never truly safe. A worker hauling a block might lose his footing, the rope might snap, a sled might veer slightly off path, catch an edge, and tip. When that happened, the momentum didn't stop. A falling block didn't pause for breath, it crushed what was beneath it. Limbs, baskets, bodies. Sometimes a man had time to shout, sometimes he didn't. There were slips on the ramps, steep, dusty paths that wound around the rising pyramid. If the slope was sharp, the footing was treacherous. If it rained, a rare but real threat, the surface turned slick. One misstep could send a man sliding into others, a chain reaction of limbs and stone. Bruises were common. So were cracked ribs. But occasionally, someone didn't get up. And when that happened, there was no siren, just stillness. Work might pause for a moment. A few heads would turn. A foreman might step in, check the body, shout a few words. The crew would shift, move aside, reassign the task. If the man was breathing, he might be carried back to the workers' village, slumped between two others, head lolling, a smear of blood on his linen. If not, if his chest stayed still, he was simply taken away. Sometimes these removals were practical, quiet. The body carried on a crude stretcher, wrapped hastily in a spare tunic. No crowd gathered, no funeral procession. A burial pit might already be dug. Nothing elaborate, just a hole in the ground lined with stone. There were no markers. Maybe someone spoke his name once, softly. Maybe not. Other times the accident wasn't instant. A chisel slipped, a stone edge tore the flesh. Infection came next. Fever, delirium. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptic. The injured were laid down in the shade. Someone brought water. Maybe a healer offered herbs, frankincense, honey, ground lotus root. But results were inconsistent. If the wound turned black, the outcome was certain. And slow. There were also long-term injuries. Backs bent permanently out of shape, knees that stopped bending, fingers that lost their grip. These men didn't disappear in a blaze of drama. They faded, quietly reassigned to lighter duties, water duty, kitchen prep. Some found dignity in new tasks, others struggled. You could see it in the way they stood off to the side, watching the younger ones take their place. Accidents were not uncommon, but they weren't discussed. There was no culture of reflection, no questioning of methods. The pyramid was bigger than any one man. And so, when a man fell, he fell into silence. But silence doesn't mean absence. In the cracks between stones, in the slightly misaligned blocks, in places where ramps were restructured mid-trajector, we see the evidence. Something went wrong. Something broke. Something had to be rebuilt. Human error or human cost. Maybe both. Sometimes workers left their own signs. Graffiti in hidden shafts. Crude images of men falling. Scribbled names beside broken lines. Maybe these were jokes. Maybe not. Maybe they were little acts of remembrance. Because even if the system moved on, the men didn't forget. There was no blame, no lawsuits, just the understanding. This work was hard. This place was dangerous. Everyone knew someone who hadn't made it through a season. The physical site had its dangers, but so did the tools. A dull chisel could slip. A block could shift unexpectedly under a lever. Even the ropes, twisted tight and strained by weight, could snap. When they did, they didn't just fall. They whipped, fast, sharp, a lash of braided fiber that could blind or slice or crush. Some workers bore those marks for life, thick scars along their cheeks or arms, stories rarely told. And yet the rhythm didn't stop. The pyramid didn't pause. One man gone meant another stepped in. Shovels were passed, chisels picked up, a broken ramp was rebuilt. A missing name folded into the long hush of the site's progress. At night, maybe someone in the village said a prayer. Maybe a group of men sat in silence a little longer, drinking beer more slowly, remembering the way the man laughed or snored or sang. But by morning, the sun rose again, and so did they. To walk the pyramid now is to walk among thousands of silent stories. Not just the story of the king beneath it or the gods above it, but of every man who bled on the stone, every misstep, every hidden cost. Those accidents, those silences, are part of the structure, invisible, but permanent. And if you close your eyes and listen, not with your ears, but with attention, you might hear it still, the echo of something lost. Not dramatic, just quiet, just real. At first, the pyramid was just a rumor, a distant idea, spoken about by priests, passed down by scribes, whispered through villages along the Nile. But then the workers arrived, and then it began. Slowly, stone by stone, it grew. Day after day, in silence and sweat, it emerged from the ground like a second sun, and for those who lived beside it, ate beside it, slept beside it, aged beside it, it was never a marvel. It was simply there, a presence, a weight. To live beside the pyramid was to watch something enormous take shape without ever truly grasping its purpose. You couldn't see it all at once. From the base, it was just endless walls of stone, ramps winding upward, the sound of labor echoing against limestone. You worked a small corner, repeated a small task. Maybe you carried jars, maybe you placed chiseled blocks, maybe you just cleaned debris from the ramps. The full shape, the triangle stretching into sky, was something you rarely glimpsed, maybe only during long walks from the workers' village, or when standing back for a moment at dusk. And yet, even without seeing it whole, you felt it. Its size was less visual and more emotional. A kind of hum in the chest, a constant awareness that something immense was being built just over your shoulder. You felt it in the aching of your arms, in the thickness of your breath, in the slope of the ground that changed as the structure grew. Each month, the shadow it cast grew longer. The ramps got steeper. The air more crowded with dust. But it wasn't just the stone, it was the idea of the stone. The understanding, spoken or not, that this thing would outlast you, that you would never see it finished, that your name would not be carved into its walls. You were a tool, like the chisel, like the lever, a hand in a sea of hands, lifting one piece of eternity. And still, you lived in its shadow. Children grew up beside it, some too young to work, watching their fathers disappear into the dust each morning. Others old enough to carry small loads, proud to walk the same path. Women baked bread with it, looming nearby, cleaned clothes in its dust, told stories at night with it resting just beyond the firelight. Some of those stories changed over time. The pyramid became a character. It groaned, it grew, it hungered for stone, not because people believed it was alive, but because it never stopped. It was always there. Living beside the pyramid changed how you moved, how you spoke, how you saw the sky. Its sides aligned so precisely with the cardinal directions that it shaped the rhythm of the day. The sun rose along its eastern face, it set behind the western slope. You could tell time by its shadow, and even when your eyes were closed at night, the shape of it pressed into your dreams. A slope, a weight, a feeling that tomorrow would look exactly the same. And yet, it was never only a burden. For some, it gave shape to life, predictability, purpose, a rhythm that replaced the randomness of harvests and floods. There was work, there was food, there was shelter, and though the labor was brutal, the routine was clear. You knew what you were here to do, and that knowledge brought its own kind of comfort. Some men became proud of their role, not boastful, quietly proud. They knew the block they had placed. They knew the edge they had polished. They knew that when the pyramid was done, their hand would be somewhere inside it, even if no one could see it, even if they weren't remembered. It mattered until they kept living beneath it. Year after year, they watched as it grew taller than anything they had ever seen, as the ramps rose higher than their homes, as the workforce changed, some men leaving, others arriving. Names changed, but the pyramid remained. A steady center in a world of movement. Sometimes it loomed too large. There were days when the dust choked everything, when windstorms turned the air into a wall, when the thought of another step, another lift, another stone felt unbearable. On those days, the pyramid wasn't a monument. It was a weight pressing down on their very breath. You could feel resentment in the way someone dropped a tool, in the silence over dinner, in the way a man stared out at it, not with awe, but with weariness. And yet, they rose again the next day. Living beside the pyramid meant never escaping its gaze, but it also meant becoming part of something no one could undo. That stone, layered block upon block, lifted by bruised hands, would stand long after they were gone. And maybe, just maybe, some part of them would linger too. In the base, in the dust, in the empty corridors that no longer echoed with footsteps, but once did. To us it's history, to them it was Tuesday. A day like any other, a life lived beside a giant. To truly understand why the pyramid was built, and why so many endured so much to build it, you have to begin with a single belief. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a god. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. In the minds of his people, he was divine, his breath divine, his commands sacred, his life the bridge between heaven and earth. That belief wasn't shouted on street corners. It was lived, woven into the air, into how people moved, how they worked, how they obeyed without hesitation. You didn't question the pharaoh's decisions any more than you questioned the Nile's flood. It just was. And in that belief, the pyramid was not a building. It was a body, a vessel, a staircase to the stars. And building it was not construction, it was devotion. Most workers never laid eyes on the pharaoh. His face existed only on painted walls, in stone statues, in carved names written by the hands of scribes. And yet his presence was everywhere, on the seals stamped into the loaves of bread, on the tally tablets in the overseer's hands, on the lips of priests whispering blessings over a morning meal. The very stone they lifted was not for a tomb, it was for eternity. To carry that stone was to carry a god's future. And this belief, even if unspoken, shaped the way the workers saw themselves. In the quiet moments, walking to the site, washing hands in a basin, resting in the shade, some surely wondered what it meant. To spend their strength for someone else's afterlife. To suffer now so that a god might sleep forever. But belief is rarely loud. It's in the habit, the repetition. The way you lift a block even when your back protests. The way you turn toward the sunrise and mutter a line your mother once said about Ra riding his solar boat. You don't need to understand it completely. You just do it, because it's what holds the world together. And for Egyptians, the pharaoh was the world. He kept the floods coming, he pleased the gods, he ordered the seasons and watched over the land. His death wasn't just the end of a life, it was the beginning of a cosmic crisis. Because the pharaoh wasn't meant to die like other men, he was meant to transform. To become Osiris, god of the underworld, to be reborn in the stars as a shining force in the night sky. But for that to happen, the rituals had to be perfect, the tomb had to be perfect, the pyramid had to rise. And so the workers obeyed, not out of fear always, not even out of loyalty, but out of something older than both. A belief that this was how balance was kept, that their labor fed the divine cycle, that every stone lifted was a star secured in the heavens. This belief wasn't blind. There were questions, quiet ones. Some men surely looked at their blistered hands and wondered if the gods were watching, if the pharaoh, in his palace of gold, ever thought of the men covered in dust. But in a world where the divine was everywhere, in the wind, the river, the grain, doubt was not rebellion. It was part of the rhythm. Religion wasn't something done on the side. It was the sky, the earth, the breath between tasks. Men made offerings before meals, whispered to statues at dawn, and wore amulets pressed against their skin to protect them while lifting stones. They didn't separate the spiritual from the physical. They prayed while working. They believed through pain. And in that way, the pyramid wasn't just a monument for the pharaoh. It was a prayer from everyone. Still, the distance between the divine king and the dusty worker was immense. The pharaoh would never know the names of the men who carved his final chamber. He would never feel the burn in their shoulders. But he didn't need to, because in the eyes of the state, the worker and the pharaoh were part of the same cosmic story. One guided, the other obeyed, and together the world turned. We often imagine ancient Egypt as a land of whips and slaves, but the evidence suggests something different. There was structure, yes, control, but also participation. Men were fed, housed, healed. Some returned home with honor. Some even rose in rank. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was necessity. You can't build eternity on a broken foundation. And so the pharaoh's dream became everyone's task, even if it was never their dream. And as they carved the corridors, aligned the stones, and raised the peak toward the sky, perhaps some felt something deeper. Not pride, perhaps, but weight, a quiet understanding that they were placing their lives into something that would outlast rivers, kings, and memory. The pyramid, in the end, was not just for the pharaoh, it was proof that the gods still walked among them, that even the dust of ordinary men could be turned into heaven. In ancient Egypt, death was never the end, it was a beginning, complex, layered, and strangely familiar to the living. And at the heart of this belief were two quiet forces, the Ka and the Ba. These weren't ghosts or spirits in the way we think of them. They were pieces of the soul, fragments of being that needed care, attention, and above all, preparation. The Ka was the life force, the double. It was you, but not in body. It lived in your food, in your breath, in the offerings made to your name. Without nourishment, the Ka withered in the afterlife. The Ba, on the other hand, was more like the personality, the part of you that could travel, that flew like a bird through the day and returned to the tomb each night to rest. Both needed a place to return to, both needed a tomb. And so for the pharaoh, the pyramid was not just a monument, it was a machine for the soul, each corridor aligned with a star. Each chamber had a purpose. Food offerings were carefully placed to nourish the Ka. Spells were inscribed on walls to guide the Ba. It was a system, a vast, sacred engine designed to launch the king into eternity. But here's where the burden deepens. The workers who built this spiritual machine had no such system for themselves. They believed in the same afterlife. They trusted in the same gods. They whispered the same prayers at sunset. And yet, their own path to the beyond was far less certain. Most would never be mummified. Most would never lie in a carved tomb with sacred texts to guide them. They would be buried in shallow pits, wrapped in linen if there was any to spare, their names spoken quietly for a generation, then forgotten. Still, they labored. Still, they carved a pathway for someone else's Ka, someone else's Ba, someone else's eternity. Imagine that weight, to believe so deeply in a system that does not make room for you. To know the rituals by heart, but never expect them to be used in your name. To lift blocks in perfect alignment so that another soul might live forever, while yours is left to drift. And yet, they found meaning, because the spiritual world wasn't only about death. It was everywhere. The wind was the breath of gods. The Nile flowed with divine rhythm. The sky goddess Nut arched above them each day, swallowing the sun at dusk, birthing it again at dawn. To work was to participate in that order. Every action, even the painful ones, fit into the divine balance, Ma. The workers might not be building their own pyramid, but they were, in their way, maintaining cosmic order. The very idea of Egypt depended on their labor, and that labor, in turn, was sacred. There were moments, too, when the lines between king and worker blurred, when a priest passed through the village with incense, when a festival brought offerings for all, not just the elite. On those days, even the lowest worker could feel part of something greater, a touch of ceremony in a world of dust. But the burden returned as the days stretched on. They watched as the burial chamber was lined with granite, polished until it glowed. They saw the inscriptions being carved, the treasure chambers sealed. They knew that a soul was being prepared for immortality, and they couldn't help but wonder, what about me? Some workers wore amulets, small, simple things, a carved scarab, an eye of Horus, a lump of faience shaped like a falcon, not official parts of any grand ritual, but tokens of hope. Carried in linen pouches, worn on cords around the neck, tucked into belts, they were small prayers in physical form, a way of saying, see me, a hope that, even without a tomb, the gods would not forget. Others found comfort in the collective. The pyramid may not be theirs individually, but it belonged to all of Egypt, and Egypt was eternal. To be part of that was, in a way, to be remembered. Even without a name, even without a tomb. There's evidence too that some workers were buried near the site. Small graveyards found near Giza hold the remains of laborers. Modest, yes, but purposeful. Burials with care. A body wrapped. A small vessel. Perhaps a tool placed beside them, as if they'd need it beyond the veil. It wasn't royal, but it wasn't forgotten either. In these moments, we see the quiet duality they lived with, the weight of building someone else's eternity, the hope that, somehow, it would help shape their own. Some scholars suggest that workers saw their labor as a form of offering, a sacrifice of energy, of time, of life itself, and like all offerings, it had spiritual weight. Perhaps they believed that by helping the pharaoh reach the stars, they too might be lifted, not beside him, but behind him, in his wake, like a servant following his master through a door just left ajar. Others might have simply accepted it as their role. Not every bird flies first, not every soul shines bright, but every soul matters. And so they kept carving, not just stone, but belief, not just tombs, but hope. Their carton bar might never rest in marble halls, but somewhere, in the warm wind, in the curve of a sandstone wall, in the shadow of the pyramid they built, some part of them lingers, quiet, invisible, sacred. The world of the pyramid was not all stone and silence. Tucked between the lifting of blocks and the hauling of ropes, there was rhythm. A different kind of rhythm. Not the dull repetition of labor, but one of incense smoke, whispered prayers, and flickering oil lamps. Because even amid construction, the sacred was never far away. The priests were always nearby. They did not build, they did not carry, their hands were clean, their linen white, their faces often unreadable. They moved through the site with an air of calm, their steps measured, their words precise. But their role was not to command, it was to maintain balance. Spiritual balance. Their presence was a reminder that the pyramid wasn't just a structure, it was a vessel for a god. Every day certain rituals were performed, quietly, consistently. Offerings were made to the gods, not just for the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife, but to bless the labor itself. Small altars, often portable and simple, were set up near the worksite. On these were placed food, bread, onions, beer, as offerings to deities like Ptah, the god of craftsmen, or Thoth, god of measurement and wisdom. The workers rarely took part directly in these rituals. They watched from a distance. Some bowed their heads when the incense smoke passed. Others stood still as the chants drifted over the noise of the site. The priest might sprinkle water over tools, murmur invocations, or draw symbols in the sand. Not showy, not theatrical, but deeply rooted in a belief that without divine order the work would falter. And the workers, though rough and tired, believed. It wasn't blind faith, it was trust born of routine. Just as the Nile rose each year, just as the sun climbed and fell, the presence of the priest anchored something in their hearts, a sense that their effort mattered, that the sweat and pain were not wasted. Occasionally a worker might approach a priest with a quiet concern, a lingering fever, a persistent dream, a charm that had cracked. The priest, calm and practiced, would listen and perhaps offer a few words, a gesture, a pinch of ground herbs. There were no grand solutions, but the moment of connection, the acknowledgement, was enough. For some, these daily encounters became part of their rhythm. They noted the hours by when the priest passed. They measured their own work by the rise and fall of the chant. A kind of invisible clock, not made of numbers, but of sacred presence. During festival periods, particularly those tied to Ra, Osiris, or the Hebsed festival of royal renewal, the rituals grew. Processions passed by the site. Music played from reed flutes and simple drums. Women ululated, men cheered softly. Offerings multiplied. On those days the air changed, even the dust seemed lighter. Workers received extra rations. There might be meat, honeyed bread, sweet beer, and perhaps, more importantly, a pause. Work sometimes slowed or even stopped for a day. Fires were lit, not just for bread, but for warmth and story. Families gathered closer. The priests walked through the village, blessing doorways, sprinkling oil, chanting softly to ward off misfortune. Children watched wide-eyed. Old men sat still, heads bowed. These festivals weren't grand pageants. They were pockets of shared breath in a world that asked so much. A reminder that even in the midst of labor, the gods had not forgotten. Over time, some workers began to adopt small rituals of their own. A short prayer before lifting the first stone of the day, a hand pressed briefly to a sacred charm, a whispered line to a loved one past asking for strength. These weren't assigned or enforced, they were personal, quiet rituals for quiet lives. And in this way, the site, so often imagined as cold and industrial, became gently sacred. Not every worker was devout. Some simply tolerated the rituals. Others may have doubted them, or participated out of habit rather than belief. But the presence of the priests, the smell of myrrh in the morning air, the echo of sacred syllables, it colored the day, it softened the edges of the stone. The priesthood itself was a world apart. Many were educated, literate, born into the temple system or trained within it. They lived separately from the laborers, but not always far. At Giza, some priests maintained quarters near the base of the pyramid, moving between ceremonies and site inspections, ensuring that the alignment of chambers matched sacred geometry, that no impure acts interfered with the divine space. Their concern wasn't progress, it was purity. They ensured that the burial chamber was sealed in sacred sequence, that the corridors matched the flow of cosmic forces, that each offering table was placed precisely. The workers may not have understood all of this, but they saw the care. And that care, in a way, comforted them. The idea that someone was watching over not just the work, but the meaning of the work. Some priests, we know from records, were kind, others distant, but all carried with them the weight of tradition stretching back generations. To the workers, they may have seemed above it all, but they were part of it too. Another piece of the system, another hand holding up the pyramid, even if that hand never lifted stone. And so, day after day, as men strained beneath blocks and ropes, the priests moved quietly among them. A flicker of white linen, a curl of smoke, a word uttered not to the living, but to the divine. It may not have eased the pain, but it gave it shape, and sometimes that was enough. You'd think, standing under the weight of 1,000 stones, sweating through 12-hour days, back aching, hands raw, there would be rebellion. That someone, somewhere in the long line of workers, would stop, throw down their chisel and say, "Enough." That resentment would boil over, and voices would rise. That the pyramid, this monumental task that pulled in farmers, masons, carpenters, bakers, would see protest, but it didn't, not in the way we might expect. There were no strikes in the modern sense, no marches, no chants, no workers storming the palace with demands. For the vast majority of the construction process, the labor force remained largely compliant. Tired, yes. Worn down, of course. But they kept going. Day after day. Year after year. It wasn't fear alone. The evidence for brutal punishment on the pyramid site is surprisingly thin. Whips existed, yes, but more as a symbol of control than a tool of daily cruelty. Overseers shouted, but records suggest that workers were fed, housed, and cared for. At least to a basic degree, there were physicians on site. Workers' injuries were treated, and some were buried with respect near the very place they worked. So what kept rebellion at bay? The answer lies in something quieter than force, something more powerful than fear: belief. Ancient Egyptian society was built around the principle of Maat, a concept that combined truth, balance, order, and harmony. Everyone had their place within this cosmic structure. Farmers planted when the Nile receded, priests performed rituals, the pharaoh ruled, and workers built. To step outside of that role wasn't just disruptive, it was dangerous. Spiritually dangerous. To rebel against your station was to disrupt Ma'at, to tear at the very order that kept the sun rising, the river flowing, the crops growing. Most people weren't trying to change their world, they were trying to keep it intact. They endured not because they didn't feel discomfort, but because they believed discomfort was part of the cosmic design. Even those who harbored doubt, the ones who whispered complaints around evening fires or muttered curses when a block slipped, did so with caution. You didn't speak too loudly. You didn't risk attracting the attention of the gods or the overseers. The stone walls had ears. And perhaps worse than being punished was being seen as ungrateful, disloyal, impure. There's also the matter of identity. Many of the workers were not slaves, but skilled laborers. Farmers conscripted during the off-season, artisans hired for their expertise. Men who came with family nearby. They weren't chained. They had homes, wives, children. Their lives, while hard, were not devoid of structure or support. They received rations, bread, beer, onions, sometimes meat. They shared jokes, meals, festivals. They had pride in their team, in their roles. in the strange, heavy honor of being a part of something grand. They even had crew names, painted on blocks, scratched on chamber walls. The drunkards of Menkore, the friends of Hufu, not the slogans of the oppressed, but the playful markings of people who knew each other, who worked side by side long enough to form identity, memory, even camaraderie. This doesn't mean they loved their task. Many surely hated it. But hatred doesn't always lead to action, especially when the system around you has made rebellion feel like a threat to the cosmos, not just to power. Still, now and then, the whispers grew louder. There are rare records of disruptions during later pyramid projects, not so much at Giza, but during the construction of other royal tombs. Workers in Deir el Medina, a village of artisans who built tombs in the Valley of the Kings, once stopped working because their rations were late. They left messages scratched into limestone about hunger, about being ignored, about the system failing them. But even then, they didn't riot. They didn't demand a new pharaoh. They simply asked to be fed, to be seen. Back at Giza, we find even fewer signs of open resistance. Maybe it never came. Maybe the system was, for all its strain, efficient enough to keep the peace. Or maybe the pyramid itself, massive, unyielding, absorbed every whisper, every sigh, every silent scream. Is worth wondering. How many workers dreamed of walking away? How many paused on the long path from the workers' village to the site, looked back toward the river, and imagined slipping into the reeds never to return? Some likely did. Not all were loyal, not all stayed, but most remained. Because the pyramid wasn't just a burden, it was a boundary. It shaped their world, defined their time. When it finally ended, when the last block was laid and the last ramp dismantled, something was missing. The silence was deafening. The routine was gone. They had lived beneath the stone for years, and even if they didn't believe every promise spoken by priests, even if they questioned the purpose, they had shared in the making of a legacy. One not tied to personal glory, but to survival, to rhythm, to order. And that, more than fear, kept rebellion away, not because they were content, but because they were part of something larger. To the modern eye, the Great Pyramid may look like a feat of engineering, precise angles, impeccable alignment, thousands of tons of stone arranged with mathematical brilliance. But in the ancient mind, it was more than structure. It was symbol. Shape was not neutral. Form was not function. Geometry was sacred. The triangle itself, the very shape of the pyramid, meant something profound. Its base, square and firm, represented the earth, stable, grounded, the world of the living. Its sides tapered upward toward a single point, reaching the heavens, touching the realm of the gods. Each face aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. These were not arbitrary choices, they were spiritual decisions. The act of building straight was an act of worship. To measure with care was to honor Ma'at, the universal order that governed everything from the flow of the Nile to the motion of the stars. The workers may not have used the word geometry as we do, but they understood it, not as math, but as meaning. The lines they followed weren't just practical, they were devotional. A wall out of alignment wasn't just a construction flaw, it was a break in the cosmic rhythm. Every stone had to sit just so, not because someone said it looked good, but because the gods demanded it. And so, sacred geometry became sacred obedience. You didn't question why the corners had to be square. You didn't ask why the burial chamber had to align with a star. You measured, you adjusted, you trusted. This trust wasn't blind, it was generational. These measurements had been used before by ancestors who built temples, canals, shrines. They'd watched the stars, timed the seasons, felt the turn of the earth in their bones. It was said that Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, had gifted the knowledge of building to mankind. Every line drawn in the sand, every stake driven into the ground, every rope pulled tight, it was all part of a sacred inheritance. At the pyramid site, the surveyors and architects were revered in their own way. They didn't just draw lines, they communed with the divine. Using simple tools, plumb bobs, leveling instruments, cubit rods, they translated celestial order into earthly structure. Workers watched them in silence. When one knelt in the sand and pressed his finger along a rope's path, It was as if he was drawing from the sky itself. Obedience to that geometry meant obedience to something far bigger than the foreman. It meant being part of the Pharaoh's plan. And the Pharaoh's plan, in turn, was an echo of the God's plan. This was the structure of belief, from heaven to king to worker, a line of intention stretching across time. Even the numbers had weight. The pyramid's dimensions were not random. The height in relation to the base formed a proportion echoed in later ages by mathematicians and philosophers. But the builders didn't need formulas. They felt the numbers. They built with their bodies, their eyes, their instincts, trained not in classrooms, but in quarries. Some elements of the pyramid seem designed purely for alignment. The king's chamber points to Orion's belt, a constellation associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife. The shafts leading from the chamber don't ventilate, they guide, they connect soul to star. A worker smoothing the inside of one of those shafts might not have understood the full intention, but he knew it mattered, that his hand in shaping the passage was helping a god rise, and that knowledge shaped how he worked, with care, with precision, with humility. Sacred obedience didn't mean blind submission. It meant clarity of role. The idea that each person had their place, just as each stone had its place, and that harmony came from everyone fulfilling their task in balance with the others. This idea filtered into daily life. A man who obeyed the layout of the pyramid, who followed the measurements and respected the order, was seen as a man in tune with the divine. Not just a good worker, a good Egyptian. And so, stones were placed with reverence, ropes were pulled in rhythm, lines were not just drawn, they were honored. Even in failure, the structure held. If a block cracked, it was replaced carefully, without anger. If a wall bulged, it was remeasured, not scorned. Mistakes weren't just corrected, they were forgiven. Because the goal was not perfection, it was alignment. Not just of the pyramid, but of the soul. And perhaps that's what made the pyramid so powerful. Not just its scale, but its harmony. Thousands of hands, thousands of hearts, all tuned to the same design, all moving in quiet agreement, with a vision no one person could see entirely, but everyone believed in. Even now, thousands of years later, it holds that shape, that stillness, that balance, a geometry that speaks, not in equations but in breath, a whisper from stone to sky. And, beneath it all, the workers, obedient not out of fear, but out of faith. Faith in the lines, faith in the light, faith that in following the shape they were part of something sacred. The Great Pyramid of Giza may tower in our imaginations, casting its long shadow across history, but it was not the first of its kind, nor was it the last. Across the desert sands, scattered like forgotten experiments, lie the pyramids that came before and those that quietly followed. They lack the grandeur of Giza. Their angles are off, their stones shifted, their kings barely remembered. But they too tell a story, a quieter one, a more human one. Take the bent pyramid of Dashur, just south of Cairo. It rises from the ground like any other pyramid, wide base, steep sides, but then something curious happens. Halfway up, the slope changes, the angle softens. The structure seems to hesitate, as if unsure of its own ambition. It bends, not a flaw exactly, but a correction. A visible pause in a place meant for permanence. This pyramid was built for Pharaoh Sneferu, father of Khufu, the king buried beneath Giza's monument. Sneferu in many ways was the real pioneer of pyramid construction. Before him, pyramids were little more than stepped layers, mastabas stacked to reach upward. Sneferu wanted more. Smooth sides, true triangles. He pushed the limits of stone, and the workers followed. But with the bent pyramid, something went wrong. Some believe the angle was too steep at the base, that the weight began to strain the internal structure. Cracks formed, stones slipped, so the architects, fearing collapse, adjusted mid-mid, flattening the slope to reduce pressure. Others suggest it was planned that way, a symbolic gesture toward the sky. But most agree it was a compromise. Imagine being a worker on that site, watching the stones rise day after day, only to hear the overseers whisper that it must change, the angle must shift, the design must yield. There must have been frustration, confusion, perhaps even relief. Flatter angles meant fewer vertical lifts, less strain. Still, The result stood as a reminder that even kings must bend, sometimes. That even gods in flesh cannot always conquer. Not far from the bent pyramid stands Sneferu's second attempt, the red pyramid. Here the angle is shallower from the start. Lessons learned, mistakes absorbed. The result? Stability, simplicity. It lacks the visual drama of its bent predecessor, but it endures. Quiet, crimson-hued, sun-warmed in the late afternoon light. Fewer visitors, fewer stories, but no less real. These pyramids mattered. They were the dry runs for Giza, the quiet rehearsals, the learning grounds, and the workers? They were the same. They carried tools forged in the same fires, wore linen dyed with the same ochre, ate bread from the same coarse flour. They shaped the bent pyramid with the same aching arms that would one day raise the Great Pyramid's blocks. Their sweat is baked into its imperfect stones. Their legacy lives in what didn't go right. Other pyramids, smaller, more forgotten, dot the desert. Many are now little more than rubble mounds, their casing stones stripped away, their names worn down by wind and neglect. Pyramids of lesser kings, shorter reigns, interrupted dreams. But each was once the center of a grand vision. Each had its teams of workers, priests, cooks, guards, and builders. The scale may have been smaller, but the rhythm was the same. Wake, work, endure. In some ways, these lesser pyramids offer more human stories than Giza. They are imperfect, vulnerable, their walls buckled, their chambers flooded. They remind us that even in a land of gods and geometry, failure was possible, and that failure was faced with quiet correction, not despair. The workers at these sites were likely less celebrated, their conditions harsher, their resources fewer. But the goal remained the same: shape stone for the soul of a king, align earth with sky, honor, order. Even if the king was forgettable, even if the pyramid would crumble within generations, that may be the most remarkable part. They knew, on some level, that these structures might not last, that time would bury them, that names would fade. But they built them anyway. Not for glory, not for legacy, but because it was their task, their role in the great balance. A bent pyramid was still a pyramid, a failed slope still reached toward the stars. For every Giza, there were a dozen lesser pyramids, lesser kings, lesser plans. And behind each one, a line of men and women doing the same work, lifting, hauling, shaping, hoping. We remember the monuments, but we live among the crooked ones, and in their quiet stones, the human story lingers. When we picture the workers who built Egypt's pyramids, we often imagine long lines of muscular men, sunburned and silent, dragging stones across the desert. But around those lines, beneath the scaffolding of history, were quieter figures, women and children, not lifting blocks or carving stone perhaps, but present, in the dust, in the heat, in the background of the monument that would one day define a civilization. They didn't write their names into the limestone. They didn't lead teams or direct construction, but they made the work possible. Behind every laborer at the pyramid stood someone, filling a jar, baking a loaf, weaving a bandage. And often, that someone was a woman. In the worker villages around Giza and other pyramid sites, women played essential roles. They weren't simply waiting at home in distant towns. Many lived near the construction zones, wives, sisters, mothers, contributing to a temporary, dusty society that functioned because of their care. They cooked, they fetched water, they mended clothes. They ground grain with heavy stones from morning to night, their hands calloused from repetition, their backs bent in rhythm with the grinding. Bread, the foundation of every worker's ration, didn't appear by magic. It had to be made daily. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of loaves, baked in clay ovens that filled the air with thick, yeasty heat. Women mixed dough with water drawn from jars they themselves had carried. They used sour beer to help it rise. The ovens were hot, the work was endless, and yet it was done, because it had to be. Children, too, were part of this world. Too small to lift stone, too young for the organized labor crews, they still had tasks. Carrying bundles of wood, bringing water to tired men, feeding goats, cleaning tools. Some simply stayed nearby, watching their parents, absorbing the sounds and smells of work. For them, the pyramid was not a myth or a legend, it was the backdrop of daily life. Some children were born during pyramid construction, laughed for the first time within earshot of a chisel striking limestone, took their first steps along the packed dirt paths between tents and ovens. Their memories, if they survived long enough to form them, would be filled with dust and sun and the low murmur of men talking around firelight. Women also served as healers, not official physicians, those were men trained in temples, but caregivers in their own right. When a man returned from the site with a split finger or a sun-dizzy head, it was often a woman who rinsed the wound, wrapped it in cloth, and whispered comfort. They brewed teas from desert herbs, rubbed oil into sore shoulders, pressed cool water against hot skin. Small acts, easily missed, but deeply vital, and in death, too, they were there. When a worker collapsed, it was often the women who laid out the body, wrapped it, murmured the farewell prayers. They didn't need scrolls to know the rites. Their hands remembered. Their hearts did the rest. Their labor was not recorded in temple walls. The names of the women who baked, healed, and hauled have long since disappeared. But their fingerprints remain, in clay pots, in soot-knackened ovens, in worn-down grinding stones, still resting quietly where they were once used. Archaeologists have found their traces. In workers' villages near Giza and other sites, they've uncovered homes with cooking hearths, child-sized sandals, and domestic tools not meant for heavy labor, but for sustaining life. These were not barracks for men alone, they were living communities. And in those communities, the emotional life of the pyramid was held together by women. They shared news, spread warnings, celebrated small joys, a baby's birth, a day of rest, a good catch of fish from the canal. They reminded the men why they worked and who they were beyond the dust and stone. Evenings were their time. As the pyramid site went quiet and the village came alive, women sang softly while preparing meals. They swept the thresholds of their simple homes. They braided hair, told stories, comforted frightened children. Theirs was not a role given by decree. It was assumed. Essential, unpaid, unnoticed, but unshakable. And through it all, the children watched. They learned the shape of duty from their mothers. They learned patience, sacrifice, endurance. Some would grow up to work on the same pyramid their father had helped shape. Others might drift away, return to farming, to fishing. But they would carry the memory of those years, the dust, the warmth of bread, the calluses on their mother's hands. It's easy to overlook them. History often does. But if you listen carefully to the echo of daily life beyond the formal construction, if you imagine the scent of barley, the sound of water jars knocking together, the laughter of children behind a tent flap, you begin to sense the fuller picture. The pyramid was not built by men alone. It was built by families, by communities, by hands large and small, loud and quiet, by women who never touched the stones, but carried everything else. The desert is not a still place. It may appear silent in the morning light, its golden sand smooth and undisturbed, but anyone who has lived near it, worked in it, or tried to build something permanent upon it knows the truth. The desert moves, it shifts, it waits patiently, then strikes without warning. And the men and women who built Egypt's pyramids had to build with that uncertainty, always on the edge of their breath. Weather was rarely the focus of written records, but it shaped everything, especially for laborers who worked under the open sky. The season of construction was dictated by the Nile. When the river flooded each year, it nourished the fields, but made farming impossible. During this window, known as a ket, many farmers became builders. The flood season was the labor season. It was predictable, rhythmic. The desert was, for a time, their employer. But the desert doesn't follow schedules. Sandstorms would rise suddenly, walls of fine dust, swirling like breath made visible, rolling across the land with a force both mesmerizing and terrifying. There were no alarms, no time to pack up or cover your eyes. One moment the sun glared down on the plateau. The next, the sky darkened. The wind moaned. Sand filled the air like smoke. During these storms, work stopped. Not because it was ordered, but because you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Workers dropped their tools, covered their mouths with linen, turned their backs to the wind. Those who were lucky found shelter behind stone blocks or in the curve of a ramp. Others simply stood still, heads bowed, eyes squeezed shut. waiting for it to pass. The sand was everywhere. In the ears, in the nose, under the eyelids. It stung like tiny needles. It coated every surface. Tools, food, skin. It filled the grooves carved by days of effort, erasing progress in minutes. After a storm, there was always cleanup. Sand had to be swept from shafts, shoveled from ramps, rinsed from stone. The workers grew used to it, but never comfortable with it. The desert could not be tamed. It reminded them, gently or harshly, that their task, no matter how divine, was still subject to the wind. The heat, too, could turn. Most of the year the sun ruled. Days began cool, but warmed quickly, climbing to unbearable levels by midday. Sweat dried almost instantly. Shadows were precious and rare. Workers learned to wrap their heads in linen, to ration water, to move deliberately to conserve strength. But even in Egypt, the seasons turned. The winter months brought something different. Cold. Not snow or ice, but a sharp, biting wind that cut through cloth and settled into bones. At night, the worker villages grew quiet, not with rest, but with the shiver of uncovered skin. Fires burned brighter. Blankets were clutched tighter. Those who had been scorched in summer now pulled their tunics close and curled into tighter shapes on their mats. The tools became harder to grip in the cold. Ropes stiffened. Fingers ached. The same stone that radiated heat in June felt like ice in January. And while the work didn't stop entirely, it slowed. The sun lingered lower in the sky. The light was different, softer, more slanted. And sometimes it brought rain. Rare, but real. Rain in the desert was not gentle. It came as a surprise, brief and sudden. The air turned heavy, a few droplets at first, cool on the skin, almost welcome, but then more. Enough to turn sand into sludge. Enough to cause ramps to collapse, mortar to run, baskets to slip from fingers. There was no drainage system, no canopy. The pyramid site was built for the sun, not for storms. So when the rain came, everyone adjusted. Tools were covered, if possible. Work paused. Fires were protected. And then, just as quickly, it passed. But even these brief seasonal shifts left marks on the site, on the workers. Fever was more common after rain. Joints flared with pain in the cold. The oldest men, whose bodies had endured too many shifts in season, walked slower. A few did not return after winter, and yet they adapted. They learned to tell when a storm was coming by the taste of the wind. They shifted their routines slightly, facing away from the morning breeze in the cooler months, adjusting their steps to account for wind-blown sand. They stored tools under layers of cloth, dug drainage channels, crude but effective, to carry runoff away from stone piles. The pyramid continued to rise not despite the desert's moods, but with them. There was something steadying in that. Something strangely comforting in the knowledge that no matter how divine the project, it was still subject to nature, to heat, to cold, to the breath of the desert as it stirred. At night, in the silence of the worker villages, you could sometimes hear the wind moving across the plateau, not howling, just moving, sifting sand, smoothing footprints, whispering over tools left out. And in the stillness, someone might mutter a prayer, not to Ra or Osiris, but to the wind itself, asking for mercy tomorrow. The desert never answered, but sometimes it listened. Not all who built the pyramids were born in Egypt. Not all spoke the same language, and not all shared the same gods. Among the sunburned faces and linen-wrapped shoulders of Giza, there were others, quieter, less recorded, foreign laborers, strangers in a land of sacred geometry and endless stone. Their stories have almost disappeared, but if you listen closely, you can still hear the edges of them, not in scrolls or stelae, but in silence. Egypt was not an isolated kingdom. It traded with the Levant, it warred with Nubia, it negotiated with Libya, and sometimes it brought people back. Not as merchants or diplomats, but as workers, captives, migrants, men who found themselves far from home, pulled into the orbit of the pharaoh's grand design. They didn't wear the same symbols. Their words sounded different in the dust. Their prayers if spoken aloud, was strange to local ears. Some had darker skin, others lighter. Some had hair twisted in different ways. And though they walked the same paths, lifted the same stones, and ate the same coarse bread, they were not always welcome. There were no official records of foreign workforces at Giza, no tallies marked outsider. But archaeologists have found graves with non-Egyptian markers, tools shaped in unfamiliar styles, pottery not made from Nile clay, traces of otherness smoothed by time but not erased. These men were likely placed on the edges of the camps, of the work teams, of the stories, not necessarily mistreated, but separated, a little more watched, a little less trusted, and yet they worked. Some were likely skilled stonecutters or carpenters brought in by trade agreements. Others may have been prisoners of war, repurposed into labor. Still others came seeking opportunity, a place in the empire's orbit, a steady ration of beer and bread in exchange for their strength. But what did it feel like to rise each morning surrounded by a language you could not understand? To haul stone for a god you did not believe in? To shape a monument that would never hold your bones? For many, it must have felt like erasure. There was no ceremony welcoming them, no record of their names, no wall relief showing their toil, only the slow rhythm of labor, the tug of rope, the heat on their shoulders, and the knowledge that their home was far behind them. They learned to follow gestures, to read the rhythm of commands in body language. A wave meant stop, a shout meant move, a clap meant lift. Some picked up bits of Egyptian, enough to get by. Others remained silent, observing, enduring. They formed small groups, sometimes living apart, sometimes folded into Egyptian work crews. Bonds were built over shared burdens. Bread was shared, jokes told in broken phrases. Bit by bit, the foreign became familiar. Still, there were limits. They did not attend the same rituals. They did not wear the same amulets. When festivals came, they stood to the side. Not always excluded, but never quite inside the circle. The priests likely ignored them. The scribes did not write of them. But the workers knew. You could feel the difference in how a hand lingered on your shoulder, or didn't, in whether someone offered a piece of fruit or turned away. Yet for all their quiet, these foreign laborers left marks. A chisel, carved in a style known from the mountains of the Levant. A ceramic cup, with motifs found in southern Nubia. A necklace bead made from materials not native to Egypt. Small things, but enough to remind us that the pyramid was not a national effort. It was a human one. It pulled people from every corner of the known world. And it asked them all the same question. Can you lift? They did. Silently, steadily, without thanks. And some never went home. Their bones were buried in the same earth as those of native workers. Their graves just as plain, just as unmarked. In the end, the desert made no distinction. Perhaps that was the final mercy. At night, sitting outside their tents, they may have looked up at the stars, different constellations from the ones they grew up with. They may have remembered a mother's song, the smell of a far-off river, the feel of a different kind of soil beneath their feet. They may have wondered why they were here, and whether anyone would remember. They probably knew the answer, but they still showed up the next day, still lifted, still pulled, still shaped the tomb of a king who would never say their names. And though history passed them by in silence, their fingerprints are in the stone, not on the outside, but inside, in the hidden corridors, the unseen shafts, the forgotten corners. They were strangers in life, but in labor they were the same. Another hand on the rope, another breath in the dust, another soul beneath the sun, scattered beyond the grandeur of Giza, where tourists rarely tread and the desert slowly reclaims what time has let slip, lie the forgotten pyramids, smaller, crumbled, broken open by weather, by time, by thieves and centuries of indifference. Their outlines barely hold. Their names, once carved in reverence, are worn smooth. These pyramids were once sacred too, but now they are quiet, so quiet that even the sand doesn't seem to gather around them the way it does at Giza, as if the desert itself has chosen to forget, and with them the people who built them have vanished. We don't know the names of the kings buried in some of these ruins. Their legacies blurred, their lineage disputed, but even less do we know the names of those who dug the foundations, laid the first blocks, hauled the stone, and wiped sweat from their brows while looking up at an unfinished dream. Their efforts were no less precise. their days no shorter, their pain no lighter. Yet they are remembered only by absence. At sites like Abu Rawash, El Lisht, Meidum and Sinki, pyramids stand half-formed or half-fallen. Some collapsed during construction. Some were never completed, others stood for centuries, then crumbled due to poor materials or flawed designs. They had priests, they had overseers, they had laborers who woke up in the cold, walked out under the burning sky and began again. Just like at Giza. And yet, no one visits their tombs, no one photographs their walls, no one builds documentaries about their slope angles. These are the forgotten pyramids, which means their builders, the men and women who gave years of their lives to them, are doubly forgotten. But that doesn't mean they didn't matter. In fact, their stories may be the most human of all. Because while Giza represents endurance and glory, these other sites tell a different truth. That not all greatness lasts, that even monuments can fail, and that even failure requires labor, planning, hope, and strength. Imagine being a worker at one of these lesser pyramids. Maybe you'd heard of the great one at Giza, seen it as a child, dreamed of touching its perfect angles. And now here you were, working on something more modest. Smaller budget, fewer resources. Perhaps a less powerful king, the limestone not as pure, the tools reused, one time too many. But still, you worked, you carved, you aligned, you believed. Or maybe you didn't believe, not entirely. Maybe the cracks in the stone mirrored cracks in your faith. Maybe you saw the slope starting to shift and knew, deep down, it wouldn't last. Still, you stayed. You did your part. Because in Egypt, work was more than effort. It was order. And keeping that order, even for a forgotten king, was its own reward. Even in failure, there was structure. After the collapse of the Meidum pyramid, once a step pyramid later refashioned to be smooth-sided, the debris was not simply left untouched, it was sorted. Blocks were reclaimed, materials reused elsewhere. There was no tantrum, no mourning, just adjustment. Workers didn't abandon the site, they cleaned it, because labor was about more than the outcome. It was about showing up, fulfilling your place in the chain, living inside the rhythm. At El Lisht, pyramids were built for Amenemhat I and Sinusret I. Time has stripped their grandeur. But nearby, workers were buried, not with jewels or elaborate carvings, but with respect. Modest tombs, pottery jars, perhaps a piece of jewelry from a child. These graves tell us that even when the pyramid above failed to shine, those below it still mattered. They were laid down with care, and that is not nothing. And then there are the pyramids we haven't even found, the ones buried completely beneath the sand, erased by wind and weather and the long forgetting of centuries. Somewhere under dunes lie blocks once lifted by hands that blistered and bled. Somewhere lies a pyramid no one will ever visit, but those hands once moved, those hearts once beat, and just as at Giza, those people once stood at the edge of something massive, something sacred. They placed their trust into something that might not last, knowing they themselves would not be remembered, and they did it anyway. In a way, their story is the story of all labor, of the millions who have built things, roads, temples, farms, houses, cathedrals, without names carved into stone, of those whose work shaped the world, even if the world never said thank you. So when we think of the pyramids, let's not only think of perfection. Let's not only think of Khufu in his shining tomb. Let's think of the half-fallen ones, the ones forgotten, the ones whose builders carried just as much weight, with just as little recognition. Because memory is not always in stone. Sometimes it's in understanding, and in understanding, they live again. The Great Pyramid still stands, its edges softened by time, its golden capstone long gone, its outer casing stripped by generations who saw it not as a tomb, but as a quarry. Yet it stands, taller than anything its builders could have imagined, surviving this long. A mountain of memory, a stone held in the sky by hands now lost to the dust. It was built to house a body, but not only a body. It was meant to protect a soul, to preserve a divine presence. The pharaoh within, Khufu, was never just a man in life nor in death. He was to become something more. An Osiris, a star, a god among gods. The pyramid was his gateway, his ladder to the heavens, his shell of eternity, but time does not always honor intention. The pyramid has been opened, raided, picked apart. The burial chamber, for all its grandeur, was found empty of treasure. The mummy of Khufu is gone, lost to thieves, fire, or centuries of silence. His dream of eternal slumber beneath tons of perfectly aligned limestone was interrupted. His journey into the stars, delayed perhaps, or denied, and yet his pyramid remains. So what then is the pyramid now? Is it still a tomb? If the body is gone and the soul departed long ago, what remains? It is in many ways memory, though not just of Khufu. The memory of a people who believed that life did not end at death, that stone could hold a spirit, that mathematics could please the gods, that the movement of stars could be mirrored in the placement of blocks. The pyramid is their story, frozen in shape, even if their names are gone. It is also a monument to labor, not the kind with titles and monuments, but the kind that wakes at dawn, sharpens its tools, and asks no questions. A structure raised by men who knew they would never sleep within it, who built a heaven they could not enter, who offered their time, their youth, their strength, not to kings alone, but to the idea that something could outlast them. And something did. Every corner of the pyramid holds 1,000 choices. A line drawn again to make it straighter, a block trimmed so it would fit snug against its neighbor, a hidden chamber built not for function, but for balance. Each detail, invisible to most eyes, speaks to the presence of hands that cared, of eyes that watched, of people who, in their way, tried to get it right. Even now, the pyramid continues to hold mystery. Not in the fantastical sense, not in alien theories or hidden codes, but in the simple question, why does it endure? Not just physically, but in the imagination. Why do we still look at it and feel small? Why do we still ask how? Perhaps because we see in it the dream of permanence, the idea that something, anything, can last, that memory can be fixed in stone, that intention can outlive death. But the pyramid is also a lesson in decay. What was once smooth is now jagged. What was once bright is now faded. The tools are gone, the scaffolding long rotted, the ramps erased by wind. Even the rituals that once kept the site sacred have crumbled. No priests walk its halls, no offerings are made. It stands now as a shell, powerful but empty, and still it speaks. To see it today is to feel a quiet echo, a whisper not of grandeur, but of effort, not of divinity, but of humanity. We see ourselves in its weathered stones, our own longing for meaning, our own desire to leave a mark. The pyramid has become something different from what it was meant to be, not a stairway for a soul, but a mirror for the living, a place where people come not to worship, but to wonder, not to offer, but to look, not to mourn, but to remember. In this new role, it serves us still, perhaps better than before, because now it tells two stories. One of a king who wished to live forever, and one of the countless nameless hands who made that dream possible. Hands that never stopped, feet that walked the same path each day, eyes that stared into the sun and saw nothing but the next stone. The pharaoh may be lost, but the memory of work, the idea of striving, remains. And so the pyramid is still a tomb, not of a body, but of effort, of devotion, of 1,000 ordinary lives made extraordinary by the simple act of continuing. There remain only some of you. Audiences are seek. The pyramid still stands, but the world that built it does not. Around it, the support systems that once hummed with life, camps, quarries, workshops, supply chains, have long since crumbled into the earth. The workers' village is gone. The ramps are gone. The voices, the fires, the daily rhythm of labor, all gone. In their place, silence. A few scattered ruins, shards of pottery, ghosts of movement long since erased by wind. This is what happens, even to the greatest projects. Not in an instant, not in dramatic collapse, but in slow forgetting. The pyramid may rise above the desert, but the workers who served it return to dust, and the places that sustained them, they return too. The quarries, once alive with hammer blows and shouts, are now quiet indentations in the earth. You can still see the rough cuts in the rock walls, the half-finished blocks left behind, like the laborers just stepped away for a moment and never returned. But the tools are gone, the baskets, the ropes, the people. Only stone remains, unshaped, untouched. The workers' village, for a time, remained intact. Mud brick homes held their shape in the dry climate. Hearths stayed where they were built. Grinding stones were found in corners, resting on the same earth they once carved flour from. But even mud brick does not last forever. Wind chipped away at the corners. Rain, rare but real, washed the walls into nothing. And so, the village faded. For centuries, no one remembered who had lived there, or why. Even the most intimate objects, combs, sandals, amulets, fell to ruin. Organic materials vanished first. Linen rotted. Wood cracked and disappeared. A worker's favorite tool, if not buried in sand, rusted away to nothing. Bones were broken by shifting soil, scattered by scavengers, or lost entirely. In time, only the hardest materials remained: pottery, stone, the occasional copper blade, but even these were forgotten. Later generations walked the same land, with different intentions. Some took the stone for new buildings. Casing blocks from the pyramid were pried loose and hauled away, turned into mosques, walls, lime kilns. No one asked who cut them first. No one wondered whose hands had polished them smooth. The stone had new purpose now, new owners. The past no longer mattered. Others dug for treasure. Tomb robbers chipped through walls, slid down ancient corridors, and carried away anything gleaming. They left broken jars, cracked skulls, footprints in the sand. Not because they hated the past, but because they needed something from it. Gold, tools, trinkets, and in their wake, what remained of the builder's work was damaged further. By the time scholars arrived, centuries later, the damage was done. Archaeologists walked across fields where workers had once shared bread, unaware at first of what lay beneath. But eventually signs emerged. Trenches were dug, artifacts surfaced, mud brick walls were mapped, and the story began to return. Not whole, but in pieces. A ceramic bowl, a flint knife, a line of graffiti scratched into stone. The followers of the powerful one. These small remnants pulled voices from the rubble. Still, for most of the workers, nothing was recovered. No names, no stories, no final resting places. Just the trace of presence, a worn patch of ground where fires once burned, a shallow grave, bones curled into silence, a flake of obsidian chipped by a hand now long gone. And yet, this wreckage tells its own truth, that labor is fragile, that systems collapse, that every structure, no matter how grand, will one day fall into fragments. The scaffolding that lifted the pyramid was taken down piece by piece. The forges went cold. The bread oven stopped burning, and eventually no one remembered how it all worked. That forgetting is part of the cycle, a quiet truth that even the builders likely understood. They must have known that their huts wouldn't last, that their names might vanish, that the tools they carried would someday break for the final time and not be remade. But they worked anyway, not because they believed in immortality for themselves, but because they believed in the task. In a way, that is the most lasting part. The pyramid endured not because of gold or ritual, but because of effort, consistent, repetitive, endlessly human. The workers never asked for their names to be remembered. They asked for water, for bread, for a small fire at night, and then they returned to the stones. The wreckage now, the scattered remnants of their lives, is not a tragedy. It's a reminder that permanence is never guaranteed, that even the most sacred projects leave behind bones and broken pots, that what matters, in the end, is not what survives, but that something was done with care. Even as the village crumbles, the pyramid still carries the memory of those who built it, not in statues, not in records, but in its very weight. It should not be standing. And yet, it is. Because once, in the long shadow of empire, 1,000 forgotten people chose to show up, and together, they lifted something that outlived them all. For centuries, the Great Pyramid stood mostly in silence. It weathered the wind and sun, watched empires rise and fall, and became less a place and more a part of the land itself. The local villagers walked by it. Travelers mentioned it. But for many it was simply part of the background, a massive, enduring presence that asked nothing and said little. It wasn't until the arrival of foreign eyes, curious, ambitious, and often romantic, that the pyramid was rediscovered. Not literally, of course, it had never vanished. But in the minds of the West, it had to be found. It had to be made mysterious again. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European scholars and adventurers ventured into Egypt, the pyramid became a symbol of ancient secrets. Writers described it as unknowable. Artists sketched it rising out of the sand like a miracle. Poets wrote verses about the passage of time and the arrogance of kings. The pyramid was no longer just a tomb, it was a story. And often the story told had little to do with the people who built it. They called it a marvel of mathematics, a puzzle, a symbol of lost wisdom. Some said it had magical properties. Others claimed it was not a tomb at all, but a cosmic machine. There were theories that it held prophecies, that it aligned with constellations in ways only a superior intelligence could design. And so, the pyramid was lifted out of its context and placed onto a pedestal of fantasy. This fascination was not always malicious. In many cases, it came from genuine awe. Standing at the base of the structure, one cannot help but feel small. The scale is overwhelming, the craftsmanship astonishing, the survival nearly impossible. But in focusing on mystery, many forgot the reality. They forgot the sweat, the bruises, the dull ache in the hands of a stonemason at the end of a long day. They forgot the workers' villages, the broken pots, the discarded sandals. They forgot that the pyramid was not a puzzle box dropped from the sky, but a thing built day by ordinary people. And some early visitors wrote diaries. They marveled at the size, but rarely asked who had built it. They described the chambers, but not the tools. They measured angles, but not effort. The story shifted. The pharaoh became central. The pyramid became his alone. And the workers, the thousands of men and women who lived and died for it, faded into the backdrop again. In museums across Europe, artifacts were displayed behind glass. Fragments of painted limestone, tools, statues. Labels listed dynasties and dates, but rarely names, rarely stories. The labor behind the shine remained invisible. And then came the wild theories. In the 20th century, books and television specials began to suggest the pyramid had alien origins, that ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly have built it themselves, that the math was too advanced, the stones too heavy, the alignment too perfect. It was a kind of erasure, not just of history, but of humanity. The truth is far less dramatic and far more beautiful. The Great Pyramid was built by engineers, not wizards, by planners, not prophets, by teams of workers who had learned from generations before them, by trial and error, by clever design, by repetition. It was built using copper tools, ropes, sleds, and sheer will. The stones are heavy, but not impossible to move. The math is elegant, but within reach of the knowledge of the time. The alignment is precise, but explainable. When we credit the impossible, we deny the effort. We strip away the humanity of the builders and replace it with fantasy. And in doing so, we make the world feel less reachable, less honest. But the truth is, there is no need for fantasy. The reality is wondrous enough. Because what could be more powerful than this? A civilization thousands of years ago deciding to create something that might last forever, and actually doing it. What could be more inspiring than the idea that ordinary people, without machines, without electricity, without modern science, could look at a block of limestone and know exactly where it needed to go? The rediscovery of the pyramid should have been a rediscovery of labor. Instead, it became a mirror for the West's imagination. But perhaps that is changing. Today, more archaeologists focus on the workers. They map the barracks. They study the garbage heaps. They analyze the tools. They read the graffiti left by the builders. Small jokes, team names, fragments of identity. The drunkards of Menkaure, one group called themselves. The friends of Khufu, said another. These were not slaves, as once believed. They were laborers, some seasonal, some permanent. They were fed, housed, and cared for. They had pride in their teams. They left their names scratched into walls, not out of rebellion, but belonging. And slowly, their story returns. Not through grand discoveries, but through fragments. A bone with signs of healed injury, evidence of medical care. A clay seal with a foreman's name, a loaf of preserved bread, charred but recognizable. A single room swept clean as if waiting for the next shift. These are the pieces that matter, because they remind us that the pyramid was not built to be a riddle, it was built to be a resting place. And around it lives were lived, meals were shared, songs were sung, hands grew tired, then calloused, then stronger. The pyramid is not a fantasy, it is proof that we are capable of building what seems impossible, even if no one remembers our names. It's strange, sometimes, what remains. You'd think it would be the gold, the glory, the names of kings, but often it's the quieter things that endure. A carved mark no bigger than a thumbprint, a groove in stone from thousands of repetitions, a broken tool forgotten under a floor that hasn't existed in 3,000 years. These are the echoes of labor, the invisible made visible by time, and though we rarely know the names of those who left them, we can still feel their presence. The Great Pyramid humbles with its scale, but it speaks in small details. The places where stone was reshaped, the imperfections hidden deep inside where no eye was ever meant to see, the subtle shifts in alignment that suggest recalculation. These are the fingerprints of human touch, embedded forever in the bones of the structure. When archaeologists enter its inner chambers, they walk into spaces that were never meant for return. The corridors were sealed after burial, the doors blocked with rubble. And yet, when modern lights flicker across the walls, there are still faint signs, chisel marks, tool scratches, small notches for levers or wedges. These aren't signs of kings, they're signs of workers, the last to leave. And they didn't sign their names in hieroglyphs of grandeur, they signed them in the way a block fits perfectly beside another, in the precision of a joint, in the silence of something done right the first time. In their own way, it was a kind of immortality, not the kind the pharaohs sought, but something quieter, and maybe more honest. You can imagine them, can't you? A man adjusting a stone one last time before moving on, his back aching, the sun going down, dust in his throat. He doesn't speak, he simply nods at the placement and walks away. That's all. That's the moment. And it's still there, frozen in form. What we leave behind often isn't what we expect. The pharaohs left behind monuments and plans and elaborate dreams of the afterlife. But much of that has faded. Their bodies were scattered, their treasure stolen, their names obscured by time. Meanwhile, a single piece of workers' graffiti remains etched in stone, laughing at a foreman, a little joke, a little spark of personality still clear thousands of years later. That may be the most enduring legacy of all, because stone remembers differently than we do. It doesn't hold on to greatness alone, it holds on to presence, weight, pressure, decision, mistake, correction. You don't have to be important to be remembered by stone. You just have to show up. There are echoes in more than the pyramid itself. In the workers' village, where mud brick walls have collapsed into brown ridges, archaeologists still find tools with handles smoothed from years of use, ovens blackened from thousands of fires, shell beads dropped in the dirt, maybe by a child or a spouse. The domestic side of the pyramid, the living side. Here, in the ruins of routine, we find the full picture. The laborer who sharpened his chisel beside a hearth, the woman who prepared dough to feed 100 men, the water carrier who walked back and forth across the same path every day, calluses forming where the strap cut across his shoulder. These lives were no less central to the pyramid than the high priests or the architects. They were its breath, its pulse. And yet, when the project ended, their names weren't inscribed. They packed up, left, moved to the next job perhaps, or simply grew old, far from the monument they helped raise. Some may have visited it again, others never saw it completed. For them, the pyramid wasn't a sacred thing. It was a place of work, of sweat and schedule and sore muscles. But maybe they did pause once or twice. Maybe, just as the last block was lowered into place, one of them turned around and looked back. Maybe he saw the sun hitting the limestone just right, making the whole thing glow. Maybe for a moment, he felt proud. Not loudly, not in ceremony, just quietly, in his chest. That moment is still there, because the stone holds it. The stone remembers weight, pressure, effort, and now, so do we. In a way, we are all builders. Most of us will not be remembered by name. We will not leave behind monuments. But we leave traces on the things we touch, the people we feed, the words we write, the care we show. We shape our world slowly, block by block, often without fanfare. And in time, even if our names fade, something of us remains. Maybe it's not stone. Maybe it's a story, a tradition passed down, a lesson learnt, a kindness offered and carried forward. The workers of the Great Pyramid didn't build for memory. They built because they had to. But in doing so, they became part of something that outlasted them. Not because of grandeur, but because of accumulation, of consistent effort, of presence. That is the echo, not the roar of kings, but the quiet of ordinary people, showing up each day and doing something difficult, with care. That is what lasts, and that brings us to the end of our journey tonight. We've walked alongside the nameless workers of the Great Pyramid, felt the weight of the stones they carried, the heat of the sun they worked beneath, and the quiet rhythm of their forgotten days. They didn't leave behind grand stories or carved names, but they left something far more enduring: presence, effort, and a structure that still stands. If you're still with me, I hope your mind feels a little quieter now, maybe even a little heavier, like sand settling after wind. If sleep hasn't found you yet, it will soon. Just let the stillness take over. Let the stories fade into the background. Thank you for being here, for listening, for resting with history instead of rushing through it. I hope tonight brought you a bit of peace, and perhaps a little perspective on how even the smallest acts, done with care, can leave something behind. Sleep well, traveler.